Now that we mentioned it. All right, welcome back to Social Studies Grade 10s. We are looking at human rights today, and this is close to our last lesson in Social 10. So the end is very, very, very near. We have, for your future consideration, we have a final exam on November 12th. That is worth 15% of your mark. I want to say there's 50 or maybe 60 questions, but there's not more than 60. We have our final A1 on the 10th, and that's worth 6%. We also have two shots at that A1. We also have one on the 2nd, so next Monday. I honestly haven't picked what A1 we're going to be doing, so I need to do that today. Thing to do. We have our final essay next Friday. We have our final essay prep next Thursday. So we have the Chromebooks book next Thursday. And I'm doing nothing but working on that essay with you. So you'll have time to work on it alone. We'll have time to talk about it, bring it all together. We know the topic. The topic was handed out yesterday. We have final midterm, multiple choice next Tuesday, and that midterm A1 next Monday. So we have today, which is a Tuesday. We have tomorrow, which I'll do some more teaching. And then on Thursday, you will watch the plague. And that's it. You know, the end is near. There is one day in there without some stuff. We'll look at some final review, but we'll also make some connections to nationalism, which is the unit for next year. So very, very close to the end. One of the most important topics, maybe the most important topic we'll look at this year is human rights. And it definitely pops up again in grade 11. So in grade 11, you will study the French Revolution. And you'll see that one of the reasons for the French Revolution was a lack of human rights in the old regime, in the old order. And one of the first accomplishments of the French Revolution was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. We will also next year in grade 11 study World War I and World War II, and coming out of World War II will be the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So human rights will come back again next year. And in grade 12 is a repackaging of much of grade 9 with some nuances of 10 sprinkled in. And so therefore in grade 12, you will see human rights again as we try to compare and contrast political and economic systems and roles of citizens and governments. So, long story short, keep these notes. I just thought we'd start the lesson with a quick quote. No doubt a quote that you studied in the last few years because we've seen a big movement in this fourth wave of feminism. We'll talk more about the waves of feminism in Social 30, but there's been lots of movement made, and this is definitely highlighting that. So, where to first? Well, first up, I'd like to begin with a couple of things. We'll look at this quote again quickly. And then we do have a 9-minute video that defines human rights and also gives us a timeline. And the timeline of the evolution of human rights is important here. And then we also have a Prezi that I created, and within the Prezi, there's a challenge. And the challenge is basically, you know, when should we limit these human rights? That in Canada, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms allows governments to reasonably limit our human rights. So we'll explore that topic of what makes a reasonable limit. So to begin with, we have this quick little quote. I understand human needs. I grew up where far too many people live day to day without elemental needs like food and shelter. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. We already have, thanks to technology, development skills, the efficiency of our work, enough resources to satisfy all human needs. But we don't have enough resources, and we are unlikely ever to have to satisfy human greed. So even in this topic of human rights, we have a nuance of economics. So we're going to go back, we're going to define human rights, and then we'll see the timeline. So first thing that you need to do is define them. And the word on the street are human rights are rights that humans have. That's as brilliant as the New Yorkers come up with. And then they're going to talk about the evolution of human rights. I'd like you to take note of milestone events. So when something happens and suddenly human rights get redefined, that's those noteworthy events. We'll watch this same documentary, the same 9-minute video. If we had grade 9 together, we would have watched it in grade 9. And if we see each other again in grades 11 and 12, you may see it again and again. It's that short and effective. Hopefully the UN doesn't block me now. What are human rights?
Human rights is.
Oh, that's a good question.
Geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Well, that's tough.
Wow.
I like how he was dressed up like a pirate. Right? So on Thursday, it's dress up day, right? And there's costume contest. So make sure that you are prepared for that. Meaning, like if you come into school and see somebody dressed up like a pirate, it's probably just somebody in a costume. It's not an actual pirate. So you don't have to go and hide your treasure.
How would we dress up like you? Would we just bring like 10 jackets with us that day?
I have jackets. You got me there. That's a good burn. I own jackets.
Human rights. Well, that's tough.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Any right that I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have?
that's a very long debate.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, è una domanda complicatissima.
If we just take it for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human.
So, we know what humans are, because you're one of them. A right is something that you're entitled to, right? A right is something that you are entitled to. So a human right is something you're entitled to because you are human. Seems to make sense. So if a right is something you're entitled to, it's a freedom that is guaranteed, and by putting the term human in front of it, these are things that are guaranteed to humans. These are freedoms that are guaranteed by birth. These are things you get. You qualify for them because you're human, because you belong to this species. That's all you need to do. There's no, well, in order to get this, you need to praise the government on social media. No, this isn't China. This isn't the social credit system we looked at earlier. These are universal rights that apply to every human on the planet, that you get them simply by being human. So they're guaranteed. And then what are they? Freedoms like? Well, in the United States, they have the Bill of Rights. And in Canada, we have the Charter. In the Bill of Rights, they have the First Amendment, which no doubt you already know all those rights, right? First Amendment rights, that's the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and petition, the freedom of association, the freedom to worship, and the freedom to petition. So in Canada, we just call them fundamental rights. And then in America, they have the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and the Fourth Amendment I mentioned earlier in the class, the right to privacy from government. So these are just examples. In Canada, we labeled them, and I used some of the labels earlier in class, like mobility rights, or democratic rights, or employment rights. So rights are things you're guaranteed because basically you're born. You don't have to qualify for them. You don't have to do something to earn them. These are universal rights. You get them by birth. And in Canada, they're outlined in the Charter. And in the United States, they're in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person. like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights.
So good news, you don't have to memorize all 30. But my grade 9s, when we take a mask break, and then I tell them that mask break is over, they like to invoke article or right number 24. We have the right to play. We're gonna stay outside. I'm like, fair enough. Fair enough. You don't need to memorize the list, because if you ever needed to, you could just Google the list. But we should understand the types of things that are on the list. So this is the list, the UN list that was created at the end of World War II, out of the chaos and the destruction when 90 million people died. When there's an attempted extermination of an entire group of people, the Jewish people, because of their culture or religion, then it's time for mankind to pause and say, wow, we need to do a better job. This is them trying to do a better job. And there's key things on here like the right to life. So what I'd like you to think of is critically, when should society be able to say, yeah, you know what, Joey, usually you have the right to life, but not anymore. Taking that away. Or you have the right to freedom of movement. Yeah, but you know what? We're going to take your freedom of movement away. You don't get the freedom of movement. You don't get the right to privacy. Something has taken your right to privacy away, that everyone else has privacy, but we're going to watch you. We're watching you. So when can the government say to Joey, we're watching you? When can they say to Joey, we're taking your right to life away? When can they legitimately say to someone that although you're meant to have no torture, is it ever justifiable for a government to say, normally we don't torture, but under these circumstances, Joey, we're going to torture you? So in order to really learn what rights are, not memorizing, that's a low mental activity. What we want you to do is think critically about their importance in your life, and how, if they're taken away, it would change your life and your relationship with who would be taking them away, the government. So we want you to consider them in connection to when can the government reasonably limit them. Because in the Canadian Charter it says the government can reasonably limit these rights. So when, in your mind, could the government say to a Canadian, normally you have the right to trial, but not now, not right now. Your trial is going to be delayed by 3 months. You're going to be detained, we're going to keep you, but you're not going to actually get a trial. So, something to think at the back of your mind for the next few minutes. And the term is reasonable limits.
Which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming.
Long time ago.
At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that.
So, she's about to give you a history lesson. She's about to give you a timeline. Not that unsimilar to the timeline that you're just noticing that I have had up on the side of the wall all semester, and you're just noticing it now. There you go. We've had at least one person notice it before. Anybody just noticing it now for the first time? Yeah. So that's okay. Situational awareness and all that stuff aside, we're about to do a timeline. in your notes just a timeline of key events that have led up to human rights as they are today. And they're suggesting in this oversimplification of history that Cyrus the Great is a good starting point. That we need to know about this guy, Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Great was a conqueror, but he was a little different. When his armies would annex territory to his empire, he would say to those new subjects of him, you have the right to worship anyone you want. And that was different. In the past, normally, when your armies annex someone else's territory, you ethnically cleanse that territory. You kill the people so that your people can move in. Or, at very least, you assimilate the people. But he's accommodating them. Just to use some language from page 58 of the textbook there. So he's accommodating them. He's saying, you know what? You can practice any religion you want. Here's my God, or gods. These are the things I worship. And it'd be real cool if you did too, but you don't have to. So somehow Cyrus the Great, thousands of years ago, was more liberal, more progressive than the Chinese government today. Because the Chinese government today is saying, you need to praise us. You can't question us. And Cyrus was saying, hey, feel free to worship others. That's very progressive of Cyrus. Progressive means seeing something new and innovative, and in this case, valuing tolerance and plurality.
After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on.
So your next note might be natural law, and it's the idea that there are things that are just natural to mankind. Maybe we don't even have to write it down. It's just, it comes natural to us that thou shalt not, kill. Well, maybe that's just a natural thing, that we understand that if we kill others, we shall be killed. That idea of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule, it seems to be a core idea or belief in many religions. Maybe that's a natural thing. So the Greeks and the Romans played around with this idea of maybe there are certain laws that are they wouldn't say genetic because they didn't understand genes at that point, but are just a part of mankind. They're natural to us.
By those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels.
She's flying through it. I needed to pause on the Magna Carta. So the Magna Carta is significant because we had a king that was behaving as an absolute monarch. And this is the king that felt that in order to keep the lesser nobles loyal, that it was a good practice to kidnap one of their children and keep them as his ward. And if that lesser noble rose up against him, he would have them quartered. And again, quartering someone is to have 4 horses hooked up to a person's body, 1 per limb, and then hit the backside of the horses so they run in 4 directions. It's not a good way to die. It's not a good way to watch your child die, and that's how the king kept authority. That's how the king kept authority, with the threat of what would happen to your child if you rose up against the king. Well, they did rise up against the king because they didn't like to be intimidated by that, and they ended up forcing the king to sign the Magna Carta. And you would think that the Magna Carta would be this huge document that in history, after that, there's no more absolute monarchs. Most of the age of absolutism follows after the signing of the Magna Carta, as we'll find out next year in 20. But it's still a landmark agreement that we can now look back in Canada and say it's part of our Constitution. We have a queen, we have a monarchy in Canada. But Queen Elizabeth II cannot behave as an absolute monarch. She is not above the law. She's not above the law. Because we have this Constitution that's even above her. So that's the legacy of the Magna Carta, is the monarch's not above the law. So we had if you look at European history, there's lots of case studies of very perverse sociopathic behavior by monarchs, by noblemen and noblewomen. And one of them is the Countess Bathory, who in her fiefdom would go to the village, entice young women to come back to her castle, and she would invite them in for dinner. But what she would do is she would have them bled to death so that she could bathe in their blood, because the Countess Bathory was said to be the most beautiful woman in Europe. But in order to keep her beauty, she thought the secret was in the blood of younger, attractive women. So that's how she kept her beauty, inspiring many Disney supervillains, right? You know, you can definitely see connection with the witch from Snow White and things like that there. So, back to the point, Magna Carta limits the power of those monarchs.
Weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king.
So if you're someone that likes dates, that's 1215 for the Magna Carta. 1215.
People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal.
So the video is coming from the United States, so of course they're going to have to tip the hat themselves a little bit and say that the forefathers, the patriots that had created America, were, you know, central to the evolution of human rights. So that's why they have this American Declaration of Independence and the U.S. War of Independence as critical milestones.
Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded. But the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name?
All right, so isn't it a summary of the course too, right? We've gone through that age of historic globalization, you know, transatlantic slave trade, the colonization of Africa, the carving of Africa. Now we're at the Gandhi video we watched. And he's going to protest against the might of the British Empire, against the subjugation of the Indian people by the British Empire. And what is he doing? He's protesting in favor of human rights.
Was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people on Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. and never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting, until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after.
And they lived happily ever after, but there's 3 minutes left in the video. There's 33% of this video left, so where does it go next? What do they talk about next? So they've given us the evolution of human rights up to 1945, and they said everybody lives happily ever after.
But they don't know that for certain.
So yeah, maybe we don't know it for certain. What types of things do you anticipate that they'll talk about in these next 3 minutes? Yes?
The countries that are part of the UN?
Yeah, maybe countries that are excluded from the UN, countries that, like North Korea. That'd be a good part of the video.
When was this made?
I've been watching this for a long time, so maybe 20 years ago, so around the millennium. So they might talk about, let's give you a hint, they're going to say a big...
Except for one little problem.
Except for one little problem.
I knew there was a but.
There's a but. There's a but. There's a 3-minute but.
There's still war.
So there's still war. So they might talk about war. They might still talk about what else? What else leads to human rights violations today?
Murderers.
Murder, war, racism, nukes. You said nukes? Yeah. Yeah, because weapons that can take away the right to life of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people with one launch. Anything else? If you're writing the script for the final 3 minutes, so we got nukes, we have murderers, we have war, we have racism, we have North Korea, China, Cuba, countries like that, totalitarianism. Yes?
People not being held accountable for their actions.
So people not being held accountable for their actions. You know, I think that's a pretty good list. I don't think we need to watch the final 3 minutes. We will anyway for interest's sake. One big one is slavery, still in existence today. All year I've been saying that there's more slaves today than at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. Guess where I got that phrase from? This video. I don't have any original thought. Running into a wall, that's just Chris Farley from Saturday Night Live. So yeah. Let's see the exciting conclusion. Exciting but somber conclusion.
If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds.
So poverty, disparity. If we have the right to food and shelter, and this goes back to Maslow, right? Maslow, right at the bottom. Tier 1, physiological needs. And the first part of Maslow's tier 1 physiological needs would be air and food. And they're saying, yeah, but there's somebody dying every 5 seconds. A new person dies every 5 seconds because of lack of food, a lack of water, even though the world has enough for everyone. So how can we say we have universal human rights when as I've been talking about it, 2 or 3 or 4 people have died because they have no food and water. Where's their human rights?
If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds?
So who are the famous people in prison today because they've opposed the government? Keeping a little watch over the next 2 years until you get to Social 30. You don't have to watch the news every night. Nobody watches the news every night. But being aware of the big stories, like when people get imprisoned because they're questioning their government, that might be important so that you can have some understanding of current events coming into 30.
If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional.
It's optional. It's just words on a page. Why is it just words on the page? Because there's no UN army. There's no UN police force. You know, what is the UN army? It's every other country's armies that they lend out. So if the United States says, you know what, we are going to violate some parts of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, then is the UN going to invade the US? And with what army? Much of the UN army is the US army. So because the UN lacks the authority to intervene in the sovereign affairs of the domestic nations that make it up, it's been very difficult for the UN to actually implement or force the UN Declaration of Human Rights into law, into action. You know, you can sign something. You can say you agree to it. That doesn't mean that you're going to actually uphold your obligations.
And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
So the next part of the video is meant to be hopeful, and now they're going to talk about activists. People that are like Eleanor Roosevelt holding the UN Declaration that is really her legacy. You know, she, the former First Lady of the United States, she was FDR's wife. This was her passion, this UN Declaration of Human Rights. Without her, I'm not sure it gets created. But who are the activists today? Who are the activists since 1945 that continue to challenge governments or corporations when they misbehave? Well, let's see who they bring up. I have a dream today.
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers, free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent, who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
So the purpose of the last part of the video is a call to action for people to become stakeholders invested in their own communities, to see how locally there's a responsibility to uphold the human rights of people that may be marginalized or vulnerable in their own community. So that's what is going on in that last little bit. So here we have people protesting, and we often see protesters. This is a protest to help former child labor or child soldiers in Uganda. Often you see protest pictures like this in Social 30, and you try to unpack it and try to find out what are they protesting against. You know, what is the problem in society, right? What is the solution they want? What are the values that they want attached to that solution? Are there any assumptions or biases that the values are based upon? Is there evidence that would further the perspective? You can see how all of those things could fit here. Gender inequality in the world. So you look at places like the Congo, and you can see that there's great gender equality there. Even though I would say we still aren't equal in Canada, you can see we're more equal than most places. So here we have a cartoon post 9/11 where the United States government has decided that because of the threat of terrorism, that they're going to take away the right to privacy at the airport. And the cartoonist is suggesting that because of the amount of scrutiny travelers go through at the airport, scrutiny that you've grown up being used to now, what is really being violated is the US Constitution. That the people are handing the Constitution over to an increasingly police state who has used the excuse of terrorism to usurp our freedom and to violate our privacy. That's what's happening in that cartoon. So the next thing that I'd like you to do, kind of like the last activity today, as I'm going to come around with some wipes for you to tidy up your area, is something that will get you ready for the first activity tomorrow. I thought it was going to say that I'm blocked from my own Prezi now. I was going to say that's just fantastic. Here's a Prezi I created on human rights, and within it, there's a list of the human rights, and I want you to think critically over the night, because in the morning, tomorrow we're going to have a discussion about human rights, and I want you to think about those reasonable limits. So when is it reasonable? When is it reasonable to, and I want you to hypothesize a little bit, think creatively and critically, when is it reasonable to say most people have their freedom of religion, but not this religion? Or most people have their freedom of belief, or opinion, or expression, or their freedom of the press, but right now we have to take these freedoms away. Most of the time we have freedom of assembly or association, but not these associations, or you can't assemble in these ways. So I want you to think critically about the reasonable limits that we see. That we still have 5 minutes, guys. It doesn't take 5 minutes to pack up. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. That everyone has the right to vote, but then we're like, it's reasonable to take the right to vote away. Or when is it reasonable to detain people, to take away their mobility? So at the beginning of class tomorrow, we're going to talk about the contents of the Canadian Charter, and I want you to tell me when is it reasonable to take these things away. Now I'll come by with a white.